Okay, Chapter 12 looks at white-collar crime and organized crime. Now, white-collar crime is first defined by Edwin Sutherland, and he defines it as a violation of the law committed by people in respectable and high social status in the course of their occupation. White-collar criminals are much less likely to be investigated, arrested, or prosecuted, mostly due to their social standing. Now, this definition has evolved over time. So originally it focused on the type of person breaking the law as opposed to the offense. But now it focuses more on the nature of the crime instead of the person or their occupation. So occupational crime is any crime committed through opportunity created in the course of your legal job. And that includes job-related violations of both white and blue-collar workers. Now, corporate crime is a form of white-collar crime. That's a violation of a criminal statute, either by a corporate entity or by its executives, employees, or agents acting on behalf of the corporation and for the benefit of the corporation. Now, these companies can be sued as well as the chief executive officers, and that culpability is going to be greatest when we can show that company officials had advanced knowledge of this activity. Now, in the United States, you can also be held criminally liable, and that's unique to the United States. Now, financial crime is what most white-collar crimes are, right? So they're illegal activities generally committed for a monetary profit. And here we can see a bunch of different types, which we're going to get into. So let's start with corporate fraud. This includes accounting schemes, self-dealing by corporate executives, obstruction of justice, insider trading, kickbacks, and misuse of corporate property for personal gain. This causes a pretty significant financial loss to investors and has the potential to cause damage to investors' confidence in the U.S. economy. Now, securities and commodities fraud includes stock market manipulation, high-yield investment fraud, advanced fee fraud, hedge fund fraud, commodities fraud, foreign exchange fraud, and broker embezzlement. The losses associated with this can be both at the macroeconomic level, to the corporate level, and to the personal level. So victims include government entities, corporations, pension funds, and individual investors. Now, healthcare fraud. All healthcare programs are subject to this, but we see it most often with Medicare and Medicaid. And it's not limited to a particular area, and it can target large healthcare programs, and it's becoming more complex and sophisticated. A recent trend that we see is the willingness of medical professionals to risk patient harm in their schemes, either by, performing services that aren't necessary. Mortgage fraud is exactly what it sounds like, fraud involving mortgages. This could include material misstatements, misrepresentation, or omissions related to property or potential mortgage, relied on by the person underwriting or lending it the money to fund, purchase, or insure it. So this could include equity skimming, property flipping. So you have flipped a property so many times and at a value that the property isn't actually valued at. And mortgage debt elimination. Now, the U.S. insurance industry is pretty big, so it's a good target for criminal activity. This could involve, committing an arson to collect insurance money, fraud in terms of workers' compensation, etc. Now, mass marketing fraud is fraud connected to communications media. These would include things like, perhaps you've gotten one of those emails before. Hi, I am a king in Nigeria, right? The Nigerian letter. Foreign lottery or sweepstakes frauds, where somebody asks you to first remit payment for taxes and fees. Or an overpayment fraud, where somebody pays you with a counterfeit check or some other type of counterfeit payment, and they pay you in excess of the purchase price. And they basically ask you to send the excess back. And some people do this before waiting to find out that it's a fraudulent check. Now, welfare fraud is the use of deceitful statements, practices, or devices to unlawfully obtain public assistance benefits. That's everything from Social Security to food stamps to unemployment, housing assistance, and workers' comp. So this is usually committed by someone whose social and occupational status wouldn't really come under this idea that we think of as white-collar crime. The dollar value of this is estimated in the billions of dollars each year. Now, intellectual property theft is stealing ideas, inventions, and creative expressions. That's everything from trade secrets to proprietary products, but also when you steal music, movies, software, etc. It's become a serious threat because of digital technology. It's so much easier to do this today. And a lot of theft actually occurs overseas. Now, once you've got illegal profits, you need to launder that money. And so money laundering is the process by which we take our illegally gained funds and disguise it as legal income. We want to convert those illegally earned assets to one or more alternative forms that conceal its illegal origin. And now in 1986, the Money Laundering Control Act and the Bank Secrecy Act are designed to combat this. But the problem of money laundering may actually be getting worse. We also have what's called environmental crimes. So these are violations of the law that damage some protective or significant aspect of our natural environment. This is often committed by businesses, like intentional pollution or whaling in places where you're not allowed to do so. Poaching. Now, terrorist activity frequently involves some form of white-collar crime because terrorists need financing. They need money for weapons, travel, and communications. Terrorist groups also often send a portion of money back home or pass it higher up in the chain of command. So one way we can curtail terrorist activities is by criminalizing the financing of terrorism. Now, what are some causes of white-collar crime? Sutherland argues differential association theory, which is his theory, where he basically says white-collar crime is learned. Becker says it's a rational decision. White-collar offenders act rationally in perpetrating their crimes. Gottfredson and Hershey say their general theory of crime, that white-collar criminals are motivated by the same forces driving other criminals. Braithwaite says white-collar criminals are motivated by disparity between corporate goals and limited conventional opportunities. And their focus here is on inequality. And Braithwaite incorporates parts of strain, subculture, labeling, and control theories. So how do we curtail white-collar crime? This is often difficult to investigate and prosecute. A couple reasons for this. First, it's often not clear what actually happened. Second, offenders are generally better educated and better able to conceal their criminal activity. Third, the evidence is probably only understandable to people who understand this complex financial and legal experts. It can be really difficult for jurors to understand. And finally, offenders can hire really good defense attorneys. Now, there are a series of laws that have been put into place to try to deal with this. So President Bush II put together a corporate fraud task force, and also passed his administration passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which has stiff penalties for corporate wrongdoing. Obama put together the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force, the Fraud Enforcement and Recovery Act, and other new initiatives that targeted financial crimes and unfair trading practices. Now, the Sherman Act, passed in 1890, prohibits monopolies, and the Clayton Act, a couple decades later, prohibits any mergers that could result in a monopoly. In 1933, the Securities Act did two things. It required investors receive financial and other significant information. So if you're an investor in a company, you usually get annual reports and other notices. It also prohibited deceit, misrepresentations, and other fraud in the sale of securities. And in 1934, a year later, the Securities Exchange Act set up the Security Exchange Commission, who is in charge of overseeing and enforcing the law in regards to securities. Now, organized crime is unlawful activities of a highly organized group engaged in supplying illegal goods and services. Now, often people think of the Italians when they think of this, and they think of Italian criminal organizations that came to the U.S. But prior to this, there were Irish groups that were engaged in organized crime as well. Once these Italian criminal organizations come to the U.S., the mafia becomes a quasi-police organization in these Italian neighborhoods in American cities. Now, there is a thing called ethnic succession. So this is the process by which different immigrant groups come over here, or ethnic groups, and they succeed after other groups and assume their position. So we saw Jewish gangs. We've seen organized crime, with other ethnic groups. Now, Prohibition is a really fortuitous event for the mafia. As soon as alcohol is prohibited, the mafia steps in. They already have experience in manufacturing low-cost, high-proof, untaxed alcohol. And they already have an infrastructure that allowed them to run and sell contraband liquor. Now, this results in a huge profit system as well for them. This is everything from bribing government officials to corruption of law enforcement officers. Now, organized crime today oversees a lot of different types of activities or rackets. Gambling, loan sharking, drug trafficking, fencing. There's a lot of pseudo businesses where they've infiltrated a legitimate business. Labor union racketeering, pirating of software, music, movies. Now, organized criminal groups are criminal enterprises. These are groups of individuals. They have an identifiable hierarchy, extensive support networks, and they're engaged in significant criminal activity. Now, a true criminal organization can function independently of any members. As members come and go, the organization is still maintained. It has continuity over time. Now, there are organized crime groups with criminals born in or with family ties to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc. And they first emerged in the U.S. in the 70s when the Soviet refuseniks are allowed to immigrate to the United States. A lot of criminals came over here to the United States. More come to join them after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so Russian organized crime operates in many countries. It's definitely multinational. Now, the Balkan criminal organizations have also been active in the States since the mid-'80s. Now, they're structured very differently. They have a more clan-like structure. They were grouped around central leaders based in villages in the Balkans. And they established close-knit communities in cities across the U.S. Asian organized crime has been active in the U.S. since the early 1900s. And these first groups evolve from Chinese tongs. They rely extensively on networks of national and international criminal associations. And there's two main categories. We have traditional ones like Chinese triads of the Japanese Yakuza, and non-traditional criminal enterprises that include Chinese tongs, triad affiliates, and ethnic Asian street gangs. Now, African criminal enterprises developed quickly in the 1980s due to communication and technological advances and globalization. Nigerian criminal enterprises are the most significant, and they operate in over 80 countries. They're famous for financial frauds like we talked about earlier, but their most profitable activity is drug trafficking. Not all Middle Eastern criminal groups are linked to terrorism, and many have been active in the U.S. since the 70s. They tend to operate in areas that have significant Middle Eastern or Southwest Asian populations. They have very highly sophisticated criminal operations. Now, transnational organized crime is organized crime, but it's operating across national boundaries. Russian organized crime is of special interest because it's grown quickly following the collapse of the Soviet Union and has taken roots in the United States. Globalization of crime requires international coordination. So U.S. law enforcement has to work with other law enforcement agencies in other countries in order to expand beyond those national borders. So what are some policy issues here? How do we control this? Well, the Hobbs Act is the first federal legislation aimed at organized crime. And it says that any crime that interferes with interstate commerce is a violation of federal law. And then we have the RICO Act, which you guys may have heard of. stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations. And it specifically targets organized crime activity. What it does is it has what's called a predicate offense, a main offense. And then other offenses that are attached to that is what makes it illegal. One thing that RICO allows us to do is it allows us to engage in what's called asset forfeiture. So when you can prove that somebody has violated RICO, you can then go after any money they've obtained illegally as a result of that racket, and things they've spent that money on. So houses, boats, things like that. Now, other things we can do, we can try to increase resources for law enforcement and increase their authority. We also need to make legitimate opportunities for success more readily available so that people don't feel the need to turn to organized criminal opportunities. And considering that these folks are often involved in things like prostitution, gambling, and drugs, decriminalization and legalization can also decrease opportunities. Finally, we can also strictly enforce the laws we already have.